Hi, I'm Carla Brown.
And I'm Brit Garner.
Welcome to Nature Insights.
Speed dating with the future. This is the podcast of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES. It's our chance to help unravel the often knotted threads of biodiversity science and policy, weaving together important stories about nature from the people on the front lines of research and action.
Brit, you just mentioned the front lines of research and action, but in the context of our episode today, we're also going to be talking about a very different kind of front line, where the impacts of biodiversity loss are most directly and negatively felt. We're going to have the chance to explore how women are typically most hard hit by the impacts of nature degradation and climate change. But as with a lot of IPBES work, there are levels and nuances here too. The voices of women are often marginalized when discussing and dealing with these challenges, but it's by no means the same in all contexts and in all places, right?
Indeed, and this is actually something I address with our first interviewee today. Put simply, at some levels, women are actually overrepresented, but at others, it's quite the opposite.
And in the developing world, the picture is even more nuanced. I come from South Africa, and across the continents, it's often women who are the ones who are farming alongside caring for children and their families. So they particularly feel the effect when land becomes less productive.
My first guest, like you, is also from South Africa. Dr. Nadia Sitas is an expert in conservation ecology. She's been an author and expert on a number of IPBES assessments, most recently the Nexus Report. She also works for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, providing training, support, and guidance for women affected by climate change. Nadia began by telling me about how she came to work on environmental issues.
So I'm very lucky that I grew up in South Africa. It's one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. My parents love nature. We always spent any recreational time in beautiful spaces. So I spent a lot of time on the beach, exploring forests, and really that was where I kind of felt at peace, but also felt inspired and wanted to try and weave that into my career somehow.
Within those human spheres, you have done some work related to gender and gender equity. What's some of your experience with that in relation to biodiversity and environmental science?
Humans and natural systems are completely intertwined. And I think so in the beginning, I thought biodiversity was all about species, but more and more kind of understanding that biodiversity is much more about relationships between, natural systems, between species and people, and the need to understand those relationships. And that's what informed my work more and more. These relationships are so different depending on who you are, depending on where you are, what the system looks like, what the state of the system is, and how exposed you are to potential hazards. And so I really started understanding that there was a deep need to dig a little bit deeper, and especially in conversations with lots of women and women custodians of nature, realizing that they play such an important role in, and always have played a role in, being stewards of our environment. But they're often, not included in decision-making spaces, or are included, but only in symbolic ways.
Tell me more about that stewardship, some examples of where and how we're seeing women be these stewards of nature and life on Earth.
So women play so many diverse roles in multiple lives, but especially in their relationship with biodiversity because of the nature of the gendered burden of domestic labor. They are often the ones that are growing food, fetching and harvesting water. And through that practice, especially for rural women, I think they just over time have developed such a incredible wisdom of climatic systems, of nature and biodiversity, of seasonal shifts, of migration patterns. And that's held through generations. It's incredible to see how that is shared and the spaces that that's shared and how it features in the way that food is prepared and shared and spoken about, and what the stories are that are shared around that. And, often it's embedded in folklore, or it's embedded in songs or in artwork. And often it is women who are the custodians of that knowledge and passing it on to the next generation. And I think it's interesting to see how those patterns shift, and whether you are in a rural space or in an urban space, and what's at risk if we lose that richness.
You mentioned storytelling and knowledge holding and the passing of this along even through things like song. In your experience or things that you've learned from other communities, How is it different for women in these societies to be telling these stories versus men?
They are maybe brought in for brief consultation, but really not part of the decision-making process. And in a way, one of the projects that we worked in Upper West Ghana saw, the impacts of climate change and the impacts of land degradation and biodiversity loss and the struggle that women were facing in terms of making sure that they could provide for their families, they could grow food, they could have livelihood opportunities, and the impacts that climate change and other kind of drivers of change was having. So how to share information and realizing that, women would always come together and sing songs as a way of awareness raising, but also self-actualization and realization and community building. And so the team there thought, well, could we work with their way of coming together and their way of sharing problems and articulating their needs and the changes that they saw in the world around them through songs and through song making. And so there was this beautiful process of creating songs around kind of understanding climate change and its impacts on different systems. And these songs were then shared between different communities, between women, and gave them a legitimate voice in spaces where they weren't necessarily invited into or allowed. And those songs were then taken into national radio stations and played across all of these community radio stations so that they could be shared with other communities, with women. And this amazing way to kind of hold and honor those relationships and that way of communicating with each other was a beautiful process. And I think that evolved with the Ghanaian team to explore other dimensions. So there was, song and sharing, kind of their own identities and their struggles, but what would it look like for another community? And because of the distance, you can't kind of have those sharing between people, but the team there thought, what about virtual reality? So could we film and document, what was happening in these spaces and the songs and the process of making these songs, and then use a VR set in another community for them to access this knowledge. So it kind of gives this 3D dimension to the sounds that they're hearing. And that was such a powerful way to share knowledge. And I think that's something that we've learned in our program is to, understand the context really well. So in that community, songs are an important medium, and others it could be around something else. It could be around dance, it could be around art, and use that as a vehicle for exchanging knowledge on understanding the world and understanding the importance, I think, of preserving biodiversity. And it's interesting because you often think that you need to do awareness raising, but those are not the communities you need to raise. They know their lives are so intimately connected with nature, and it's often those more removed and detached people in cities and in urban spaces, that have lost that intimate connection.
It sounds like stories are the things that we have. There is no lack of stories and of knowledge being held. The question is, how do we tell them, and how do we make sure everyone can tell them? You mentioned exposure and burden. What are some of those exposures or burdens within communities that you've worked with when we look at global impact when it comes to gender and that identity with biodiversity and nature?
I think there's so many different impacts. So it impacts, livelihood opportunities and whether you're living in a coastal system. Some of the work that we've done in Senegal with fisherwomen, they interact with the ecosystems very differently depending on kind of cultural norms and practices, how deep you may go into water or not, what's seen as a man's job versus a woman's job. And I guess it's, the revenue that gets generated from those different roles, which then also translates into food security impacts. And so I think really depending on where you are in the world and what your ecosystem is and what your kind of productive activities are in that system, women are impacted differently. But across the board, I think there are these disproportionate impacts, and that's both in terms of their exposure to kind of the climate impacts. So women are really impacted when natural disasters or natural hazards strike, and also in terms of their loss of cultural roles. So often the shift to different types and different ways of living, there's also pressure on women to behave very differently. There's a disconnect between how they kind of have always been with what's expected in these new systems, and that's especially important in forced relocation. So, if a protected area that has got good intentions in terms of biodiversity conservation, but hasn't necessarily thought about how that will impact the people that have always lived in those systems and suddenly they're forced out of it. And if a woman has always harvested resources within that natural system, what does she need to do in those new places? And so I think it's really important to think about the ways that kind of rights-based approaches and human rights-based approaches can account for gender and other issues linked to social identity. And I think often women's work within those systems is unpaid. So, their domestic labor is unpaid, their productive labor is unpaid, their childcare labor is unpaid. And all of that is also seen as invisible. So it's just seen as expected. And so I think in addition to maybe growing crops or harvesting other types of natural resources, they're also playing these pivotal roles in kind of families and in communities. And that's unseen. And that just gets compounded when there is some kind of scarcity.
There is a non-ending list of these ways in which women are disproportionately impacted. I also wonder, though, about the disproportional nature of representation you were talking about within decision spaces. Interestingly enough, I remember undergrad, master's, PhD, any of these things, these rooms for wildlife biology, marine biology, environmental science, wildlife ecology, they were full of women. There were maybe 2 dudes and then, 17 women like in these classes and spaces. Now, granted, that's in a Western university setting in the United States. But I wonder, where is the disconnect? Because I can say even within these spaces, that is not what the leadership necessarily looks like. So I also have seen a difference in where it started and then where it ends.
My experience was very similar to yours. Lots of other women in my undergrad and postgrad classes, maybe not so much in kind of the wildlife sciences, where at least in South Africa, those were seen as more kind of manly professions, but definitely in the opportunities that were given in terms of fieldwork. So, there's a fieldwork project and who gets the opportunities for that. There was a surprise if a woman stepped up for that. So sometimes the desk-based research, fine for women to do that, but maybe moving into these kind of more risky situations was often considered, not a role for women to be, which is, crazy because in my experience, at least in kind of working in lots of different rural contexts, women far outperformed a lot of our, at least my male counterparts in terms of getting up every day, doing the work, providing some different insights into some of the experiences and collecting data. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in those spaces. And that's just for women scientists. So if you're thinking of like rural women leaders or Indigenous women leaders, there's a lot that needs to be done. So they're not just invited there for the photo opportunity, but there's a genuine interest in ensuring that their needs, priorities, values are taken into account in decision-making spaces.
Hearing about Nadia's background really rings true for me, having also grown up in South Africa. Having the privilege to access and experience such incredible biodiversity and also having that experience be really formative in shaping both of our career paths.
Now, you say career paths. I'm actually curious for you what your experience was as far as when you were in college or when you moved past college, both in terms of how many women were, majoring in the thing that you were, but then also where they were in leadership.
So my experience is a bit opposite to Nadia in that both my parents were hard scientists and I gravitated to the social sciences. I started out in law, but then moved into studying in economic field, sustainable development. And I must say, in my classes, there weren't many women in terms of leadership positions. We didn't have a lot of female lecturers, but I think that is changing. But when I was coming up, I think conservation in the environmental field as a whole, as Nadia also said, was very, very much male dominated, including in the decision-making and leadership space.
Obviously, there's a million nuances and layers, but it is cool to think about just where you are on Earth can fundamentally change how that difference appears. And, Nadia highlighted the issues about women getting into those meaningful positions, but then also not finding themselves, completely pushed to one side once they're there, or also just being tokenistic in terms of their presence. What did you think about that?
I think, it's actually such a juxtaposition because you have these people, as Nadia said, who are really the knowledge holders when it comes to biodiversity science or just experiencing it differently to men. And yet they're sidelined and kind of relegated to be bystanders in a topic where they perhaps have the most to say and the most valuable contributions to make.
Yeah, and that idea of unpaid and kind of unseen labor at every level really kind of brought that home to me, thinking about from kind of the start to the end of a day, what those roles might look like and how much burden there actually is on rural women, despite them, again, having that core stewardship when it comes to biodiversity.
They don't need to be empowered. They need to be compensated and
Right.
recognized and listened to. So
Yeah, you said listen to, for sure. Storytelling. My heart. That meant so much just to hear that is part of the toolbox. This fact that like the stories need to be told, and not just to others who might not understand, but literally to each other.
I think as two science communicators, we can probably geek out about that aspect of it together.
Yep.
Especially since it's not just about the stories, it's about the methods by which those stories are carried across. So, for example, the storytelling not only through song, but now through this new technology of VR, where you can literally put yourself in someone's shoes to be able to understand their perspective or their story better.
And yeah, seeing the use of technology to empower storytelling, not that it needs to be empowered, right? Just needs to be facilitated. It just has to happen. Such a cool example of seeing storytelling really flourish in ways that we may never have thought of.
Absolutely. It's clearly challenging for many women who work and depend on the land, but they are also often frontline champions and stewards of our natural environment.
We also know that these challenges extend well beyond issues of land, for instance, into the lived experiences of women involved in policy work and environmental science and research. This was really evident in the conversation I had with our second guest today, Nita Shashidharan, who is a researcher with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment in southern India.
I think if you speak to any woman, whether she's from the field or not from the field, everybody will have a story regarding gender issues, gender discrimination that they have faced. And with respect to this field, in my work that I have been doing, so I'll give you the closest example that I have about how I experienced gender on the field. I was working in this tiger reserve, the Satyamangalam Tiger Reserve, which is also the place where I do my PhD on. So I was to also choose field assistants to help me along on the field. I had funds only for one, so I had to make that choice. So initially I got a male field assistant for a short period, and at that time I went to some of the villages. They were okay with me coming in the evening for some of the interviews. And then we had COVID, and I had to let go of that field assistant, and I had another round. And this time when I had those applications, I found that one of the applicants who stood out to me was having experience in that area itself. Found it to be a perfect match. And she is a woman. And people who have gone for interviews, like have been working in the research and doing interviews, have told me that generally they have experienced that generally it's better that you have a gender balance of male and female when you go to the field. But I was a little adamant at time because I just could not understand. I mean, they had come from that experience, but I guess since I had not experienced it yet, I was like, okay, this doesn't make sense. I mean, I can have only one person. Do I want a skilled person, or do I just want to keep the gender balanced? So that's how I went on selecting, getting her on board, and she was really awesome at her work. She tried her best. But what are some of the things that happened is my access to communities at time, it became very time bound, because beyond 6:30, beyond 5:30 in the evening, we don't want you coming in, because both were women. Even though we would hire a vehicle and come in, it felt like, what is going on, you know? And the first thing that one might think is, okay, this is a form of stereotyping or a gender discrimination and so on. But if you try and again take a step back and think about, you come from an urban area where this is very common. People are used to seeing two women roaming around, going around doing their thing even late in the night or irrespective of the time slot. We were outsiders. They probably felt a responsibility for outsiders coming in. If something happens to us, they would be blamed. And we were also women. And they felt that so-called hospitality or, the social norm dictated that they were trying to see to that we aren't there. It was affecting my work for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're mentioning, there's all kinds of reasons why a decision or a behavior might happen as far as a community. And it doesn't just have to be discrimination. These are things that might be coming from a place of good intent or protection or whatever that thing is that's built in. And so I really appreciate the different factors and the multiple factors that you mention in that experience. I also wonder, while doing this research, being in the field, particularly when it comes to things like biodiversity, climate change, land usage, do you see gender disparity within those voices, especially within these more rural places, not within city? What have you seen as far as that while doing your field research?
Even though I don't use a gender lens for my work, we all see gender and experience gender in different ways. And on the field, while I was doing these focus group discussions, I was doing oral histories, and even before. So since I'm an outsider coming to a village and going to go and ask them questions, I first take a permission from the village head, who's supposed to be the key contact point for the village, for anybody from outside, for any decisions. So I used to go to each village, try and find out who is the village head and ask them for permission so that he informs the community. So I must have gone at least to about 30, 40 villages over the time span. And in each of the locations, I only met male village heads. Everywhere, they were all male. And in one of my oral histories, when I was talking to a woman, and while we were having the conversation, asking a question related to non-timber forest and issues of climate, etc., I asked her this question about, I've been noticing that, there's, when you have village heads in the village, and these were all male. And why is it that I haven't seen or no women is participating in these kind of activities? What she told me something that also I feel that we take some time for granted in our spaces, where we have over time learned to advocate for ourselves, and also say when we don't want to do things at all, just put our foot down, and there's a social conditioning to quite some extent, the dependency, especially the dependency is more heightened when women don't have access to property in the form of, like, whether it be land rights or collection rights, And she said that, we do also help with all the household work, and we still go for collection of the forest produce. And after that, we have to still come back and also do work in the house after walking for so many kilometers. And if we also get involved in this, we have seen that, there be problems. The family experiences issues. So this is one way that women get affected. And the second is not having ownership over land. If you go to many rural villages, you see that most of the properties in the name of the land is in the name of the men, of the male head.
So it's fascinating that even though you were never intending and didn't and don't have a gender lens in your research, time and time again, it still appeared as a factor of importance, it sounds like, which
Right.
is such a reminder that we can try to ignore these things because it wasn't the question we were interested in, and yet it still plays this role. You mentioned asking the women within these communities about leadership and about why certain things might be the way that they are. And it made me wonder, was you asking that question at all something novel? I wonder if having women in field research with environmental science, biodiversity, land use, if just having women out in the field asking these questions makes a difference.
I think one is that there's a bit of social conditioning in many women of, it may not always be done on purpose, but feeling unseen or invisible. And there's a tendency for, what I have observed is that you look out for other women. If I'm on the field, I'm not just going to, if I was even working on, for example, wildlife camera trapping, for example, I wouldn't just do that and come back. I would be around, I would see who all is involved, try to understand the space, It's not a very mechanical thing for me. And when I go to spaces like this where I see other women and I don't see them in positions of being able to take such positions of leadership, it strikes me because I see that happening in many other spaces. We have seen this, I think it's also well documented about even women in science, there being this leaky pipeline wherein after a particular degree, for example, after your PhD or whatever, you see things going downhill because women probably get on many other household activities, may or may not get enough support, etc. So I think it's very essential to bring different voices. I mean, I personally have this take of looking at people not in terms of just only the gender, but as human, as you know, irrespective of whether Brit is from UK or from America or she's from wherever, she's still a human, and that's how I would look at it. So if I'm in a space and I see everybody is having certain positions, who is missing from it? That is something that automatically strikes my mind. But whether I can say that this is something that every woman would do in some spaces, right, is fully women-led, yes, for sure, because there's a particular focus in the mission. But if there are, for example, there are women who are not that socially attuned in terms of may not be working on social sciences or may not be interacting, going out of the forest. They are working just in the poor forest. So I have seen instances where this has also occurred. But that does not mean that we do not, or their voices are not needed. They are all human, yes, but still each had their own set of diversity coming from whichever background they are. And for so many years, we have only heard about men. So why not talk about women and other minorities right now? So I think they'll bring some voices which for so many years were missing. So I think that's what speaks to me.
I think what Nisa said about not being able to speak for other people is a really important point to emphasize. Just because I'm a woman from South Africa, that doesn't mean I can speak to the experiences of all South African women. And intersectionality is an important element to understanding and engaging with this topic properly.
Big time, especially when thinking about the intentions or reasons that some of these barriers might exist. You know, we might see issues gaining access to communities or, as Nita was mentioning, being out at certain times of day. But it's not just because of wanting women to be excluded. It's not that easy. We can't reduce it to that. This can be from, years and decades and millennia sometimes of culture and practices that actually could be intended as protective or as positive in the way of those framing it.
But regardless of the intention, women are still deprived of the power, despite the fact that they are critical in their roles as stewards of nature.
Yeah, even just land rights, the idea of being a steward of land, contributing to it, working on it, being a piece of it, and then literally not legally owning it or having any stake in it when it comes to the regulation or even, what we would think of as ownership legally, is such an irony or juxtaposition.
I remember learning about woman-headed households. They can't own it even if they are the only person managing this property. It still needs to be owned by a man, which is really unfair.
Yeah, I'm sure that you can find examples of that across time and across space as far as human societies, where there have been different structurings as far as that's concerned. And certainly now, especially seeing the burdened sort of repercussions and negative impacts on women, you'd hope that we can find ways to increase where we see women in those positions of power, or at least having agency.
Absolutely. And it also shows that conservation shouldn't be limited to looking at how are we actually managing ecosystems. It should also extend to rights for people and changing societal norms and standards.
Honestly, at the end of the day, I think we could fill several seasons worth of material when it comes to the intersections of gender and biodiversity. I really think we are only beginning to scratch the surface in this episode together, asking questions certainly, but my goodness, is there a lot more to be done.
Absolutely.
So that's it for this episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future.
I'm Carla Brown.
And I'm Brit Garner.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. The next episode of Nature Insight will explore the often misunderstood concepts of rewilding and restoration. not only on land, but also in marine ecosystems. You can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of our social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Nature Insights wherever you get your podcasts.